you get started? I think we will.
Let's go.
All right.
Showtime.
Yeah. So good evening, everyone. Thank you for coming out to this event tonight. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Elizabeth Holland, and I'm a sophomore in the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown, and I'm the Vice President of Marketing for this Federalist Society chapter. Before I get to introductions, I would like to state that the views presented by the speakers tonight are not necessarily reflective of the Federalist Society opinions, and they are the speakers' own viewpoints. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the Honorable Thomas B. Griffith. Judge Griffith was appointed to the United States Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit by President George W. Bush in 2005. As a graduate of Brigham Young University and the University of Virginia School of Law, Judge Griffith was a litigation partner with Wiley, Rein, and Fielding in Washington, D.C., prior to being named Senate Legal Counsel of the United States. In that capacity, he represented the interests of the Senate in litigation and advised the Senate leadership and its committees on investigations, including the impeachment trial of President Clinton. Prior to his appointment to the D.C. Circuit, Judge Griffith was the General Counsel of BYU. He has long been active in rule of law projects in Eastern Europe and Eurasia and has taught at the law schools of Harvard, Stanford, and BYU. Judge Griffith is also a member of the advisory board of the Neal A. Maxwell Institute for Religious Scholarship. He retired from the D.C. Circuit in 2020. Thank you for being here, Judge Griffith.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I'd also like to thank our moderator, Peter Lee Hamilton, for being here tonight. Peter is an alum of the Georgetown College, class of 2020, and is currently studying at the University of Virginia School of Law, where he is a 1L committee member of their Federalist Society chapter. I will now hand it off to him to continue the event.
Yeah, well, thank you, Elizabeth, for the kind introduction, and a great amount of gratitude to the Federalist Society undergraduate chapter at Georgetown and to my good friend, David Park, for helping set this up and reaching out to me. I appreciate that. For our honored and esteemed guests, it is always a pleasure to speak to other Georgetown students and to bring these great speakers. And I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to come hear us talk about civic charity in the Constitution. So we'll be focusing on a piece that the judge published called Civic Charity in the Constitution. And Judge, I think it would be great to get started if we discussed how you define civic charity and the way that it's been manifested, and as we talked about how it's been present in the United States since even before our founding.
Yeah, so the idea is not mine. I'm relying on the scholarship of a young political scientist whose name is Matthew Holland, and Professor Holland's PhD dissertation at Duke was on civic charity. The idea of civic charity and the founding of the Republic up through the time of Abraham Lincoln. The title of this book is Bonds of Affection, which was actually published by Georgetown. And I would highly recommend it, Bonds of Affection. And Professor Holland traces this idea, this notion called civic charity, civic love, civic friendship. It's actually an idea that goes back to Aristotle, but he traces it in the American experience from the Massachusetts Bay Colony on through the founding, through Jefferson, and its fulfillment in his view is in Lincoln's first inaugural address, where our greatest president at the moment of the greatest national peril utters those immortal words: "We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection." And so it's the idea that there are bonds of affection that create community. And so my idea was to see how that works in the Constitution, or if it does work in the Constitution. So that's the idea. The premise is that it has to work for the Constitution, that it's the soul of the Constitution. That without a group of people who genuinely want to create community with one another, the Constitution is just all form, and that the substance of it comes from this desire to unite together. Maybe we can talk more about that later. You're going to ask me some leading questions along the way, aren't you, to to tease that out. Otherwise, I could just give the whole talk right now based on what you said, but I don't think you want to do that. Let's have a dialogue.
We can dive into it. So with the soul of the Constitution and it being a requirement, I guess you mentioned in the piece about the writing of the Constitution and its formation of the document, and how actually civic charity was needed even just to write it. And what did that look like when they were in Philadelphia, just sitting around and trying to figure out what exactly to put on the page?
Yeah. So for this, I rely on the work of a young scholar named Derek Webb. Derek studied under Michael McConnell at Stanford. He's an attorney now in DC at Sidley and Austin. A promising young scholar, and he wrote a piece in the South Carolina Law Review, published a couple of years ago. And its title was "The Original Meaning of Civility: Democratic Deliberation at the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention." And I just think it's a brilliant piece of scholarship. And what Derek shows, he starts with the familiar. It's July of 1787. It's hot as blazes. And the convention is foundering, right? Are actually packing up and leaving because they weren't going to achieve success. And yet, just 2 months later, maybe 6 weeks later, in September of 1787, they've achieved success. They've cobbled together a constitution. George Washington, in writing, sending the Constitution to Congress, gave this explanation: the Constitution is the result, and here are the key words, the result of the spirit of amity and mutual deference, which the peculiarity of our political situation rendered indispensable. The spirit of amity and mutual deference. That's what Washington said. And so Derek Webb goes about to try and figure out, well, how did they do that? How did they pull it off? And here are his ideas. He looks to a couple of factors that were unique at that gathering. And it all turns on small group dynamics. The first thing that Webb points to is that they socialized with one another. You start with the idea that these delegates were housed together in a small city. There wasn't a lot of boarding houses available, so they had to live in the same room, sleep in the same bed. They were in close quarters with one another. Every day, the convention met Monday through Saturdays, typically from 10 in the morning till 4 in the afternoon to do its business. But then afterwards, they broke off and had to eat, right? Same problem faced them. There weren't a lot of eating establishments available. So they ended up eating in the same establishments, many of them did. And then they created dinner groups. These dinner groups were comprised of people from different parts of the colonies. And they weren't dinner groups that fell along ideological lines or regional lines. They just were people who got thrown together and ended up having dinner together regularly. At key moments throughout the convention, Webb documents that Benjamin Franklin, who had the nice house, right? He lived in Philadelphia, had a beautiful house, that he would open up his house to have these lavish parties with just the best cuisine. Apparently, he had an excellent store of port, and that libations flowed freely. It was very convivial. George Mason from Virginia described this sociality in a letter to his son, where he said, "We learned to grow some acquaintance with each other and form a proper correspondence of sentiments." And that was done through partying, through socializing with one another. So that's the first thing that Webb focuses on, is this sociality. Second thing is the rules of the convention. They were distinctive. The first rule was attendance was mandatory. If you were in Philadelphia, you had to show up. Now, I don't know of any instances where the sergeant of arms was sent to compel someone to attend, but I believe that the rule of mandatory attendance succeeded. So you had to attend. When you were in the convention, when you were in the State House, no talking or reading was allowed while someone held the floor. No talking, that makes sense. That's just impolite, right? To talk when somebody else has got the floor. But no reading was allowed. And the point, obviously, was to compel the delegates to pay attention to one another. And that's a really significant rule, right? I mean, we've all heard the truism that listening is a dimension of love, that if one cares for someone deeply, you listen to them, right? You just don't talk. So anyway, so that was one of the rules. You had to pay attention to one another. Of course, we know there was no official record of votes kept, and the meetings were in secret. And as Webb points out, that allowed the delegates the freedom to change their views. They could vote one way on a proposition in May and change their mind and vote another way in July. And no one would accuse them of duplicity or hypocrisy. You wouldn't be able to run any negative ads saying, I voted for it before I voted against it, right? There was a freedom that was allowed from the fact that no official record of votes was kept and proceedings were secret. But the key moment, according to Webb, the key moment was when they came to the impasse over the representation of states in Congress, right? I mean, this was the key moment. And as Webb tells the story, the success in the Grand Compromise started with the decision to compromise. And they decided to compromise to save the convention before they knew the terms of the compromise. Now, I want to submit that that is a really remarkable thing that gets at what I think is the key to success, not only for the creation of the Constitution in the summer of 1787, but for our continued commitment to the Constitution today. I'll get to that in a second. But they made a determination to compromise. They created a committee, and the committee met at Franklin's home, where the food was good and the libations flowed, right? And it was a committee of 9. It was a committee of 9 moderates. Yeah, moderates, right? A dying breed in our polity today, a dirty word for many, but it was 9 moderates who met in Franklin's home and came up with the terms of the compromise. Now, here's what I take away from that. The most fundamental impulse that created the Constitution was union, was the desire to create a community out of these different regions that had very different economic bases, right? And had very different views. They agreed to compromise for the sake of union before they knew the terms of the compromise. So that's the insight. That's civic charity, right? That's saying, that's somebody with a MAGA hat saying, no, I really want to live in the same community as saying. That's the spirit of that. That's called civic charity. Lincoln, as I mentioned before, Lincoln gave the greatest expression of this, as he did to many other things, in his first inaugural. A more modern expression would come from Michael Gerson, who wrote, "The heroes of America are heroes of unity. Our Constitution is designed for vigorous disagreement. It is not designed for irreconcilable contempt." So that's what I offer, is that the fundamental impulse that created the Constitution was the desire to create union, and to create union, you have to compromise. Anyway, that's got a little carried away there, but anyway, it goes beyond what happened that summer. But I think Derek Webb's insights are instructive.
No, I think it's helpful to enter into this discussion, I thought, the fuller picture, and to understand what really was beginning to manifest itself in the behavior and in how they interact with one another, and that we can look to today, and that might be fundamental for how we interact with one another today. So to focus on that summer, 3 very tangible things that they did, or 2 tangible things and 1 somewhat, I think, intangible. That's much more difficult to achieve. But the first one is they forced them to socialize together. The second one is they forced them to sit on sit in the room and listen to each other and pay attention, which, if anybody has ever watched C-SPAN or anything like that, the Senate floor and the House floor are almost perennially just empty. I mean, they're never in there. And then the third was, which I think is a little bit harder, is they were willing to compromise for the sake of a workable end goal. Yeah. And I think that one might be a little harder to achieve. But I'm just curious, what do you think would happen if we forced the first two onto Congress today? We force them to socialize together. You say you can't go home to your district except for, I don't know, the fourth weekend of every month, every other time you have to be in DC, and then forcing them to sit in the Senate and in the House and actually pay attention to one another.
Yeah, that wouldn't work. It wouldn't work. But but there's some other things going on here that speak to the same issue. So, for example, here's one that may sound convoluted, but I'll try it out on you. See what you think. So when was the last time that Congress voted itself a pay raise? I don't know. They don't do it, right? They don't do it. They have these cost of living adjustments. But I don't remember. It's been a long time ago, because when they vote themselves a pay raise, what do people say? What do people say? They say it's self-dealing, right? So as a result of that, they're underpaid. Right. In fact, they're so far underpaid that they can't afford to live in the DC area. Right. And so so you have this phenomenon where, what was it, 25-30% of the members of the House of Representatives live in their office, on the couch. They sleep on cots in their office, and on the couch, and then they bathe in the gym because they can't afford to buy a house in the DC area, or if they do, then they get primaried as they've gone native, right? And so as a result of that, they live in these awful circumstances. I remember 15, 20, maybe 25 years or so ago, one of these nightly news magazines, ABC's version, I think, followed around a number not far from the Capitol, and it was like a tenement. It was awful. It was cockroaches everywhere, and it was just an awful, awful place because they couldn't afford to buy a home in the DC area. Okay, now I'm an old man. I grew up in McLean, Virginia, right outside DC. I went to my solidly middle class. My father was retired military, worked for the federal government. My mom, so we were solid middle class folks. I went to school with the sons and daughters of congressmen and senators and Supreme Court justices. That was nothing unusual. I was nothing elite. That's who lived in McLean, because they lived there then. But they don't anymore. And so what that meant was, it was not uncommon on a weekend to see congressmen and senators at their kids' Little League baseball games. Nobody was playing soccer then. We weren't that advanced then. But now you would say, at the soccer field. And they got to know each other as, they go to PTA meetings, and their kids would go to the same schools, and they got to know each other. And now, look at it now. What was it, a decade or so ago, the great novelty was that State of the Union address, there was going to be date night. And the great novelty was that if you were a Republican member of the House, you were supposed to go find a Democratic member of the House and sit together during the State of the Union. Isn't that sweet? How sweet is that? Well, that just shows you how absurd is that? They fly, they're there Tuesday through Thursday, and then they have to be back their home districts to do work. They're doing real work, but they just don't know one another. I was at a breakfast on the DC circuit with a senator. He hasn't given me permission to tell this story, so I won't tell his name. But he's a senator you would all recognize, and he was bemoaning this fact. He said, the only time I get to socialize with someone on the other side of the aisle is either in a gym or a Bible study. And this was coming from a Democratic senator. He said, that's the only time. He said, that's not much. I don't know anything about their partner, their spouse, their children. I just don't know them. We sit together in committee meetings, but I don't know them. So what I want to offer is that makes a difference, maybe only at the margin, but it makes a difference. And on this one, it's our fault. Okay, it's the American people's fault, because we won't let them have the type of salary they need so that they can live in DC and their families can come back. Anyway, that's so that's one thing that I would do. Let them vote, let them have decent salaries so they don't have to live the way that they do. By the way, that's not a recommendation that's going anywhere, anytime.
Right.
But that's one thing. If I were king, that's what I would do. Here's another ironic feature. So when I was the counsel to the Senate, which by the way was just a fabulous job. I had to pinch myself all the time to imagine that I was in the meetings I was in with the people I was with, and but I noticed a phenomenon, and that is that when the senators were on camera, trying to make the best possible impression for the electorate, didn't really work too well. It really didn't work too well. But then we'd be in a committee meeting over a contentious issue, some investigation, and they need to go to an executive session. And so the TV cameras would go off, they'd clear the room of all but the most essential staff, and then they'd talk to one another. And it was like, who are these people? They were kind to one another. They called each other by first name. You just got the sense that these are really smart, good people who are trying to do the right thing for the country, right? And then they'd come out of executive sessions, light go back on again, and then they'd see then they display what we normally see, which isn't very often very impressive. So it can be done. So I guess that sort of speaks to the secrecy. Now I'm for transparency in government. I don't know what to do about this, except that I can see how the secrecy surrounding the Constitutional Convention was critical, because they're not on stage for anyone. This debate kind of spills over into the issue of whether there should be cameras in the courtrooms, and because I'm a child of the Watergate age, my tendency is more towards transparency than not. But I was it wasn't private, so I can repeat this. But cameras in the courtroom, and he always has these great quips, and I won't do him justice because I'll bungle the quip that he had. But he had something like, identify the part of government whose work has improved in front of the TV cameras, and so I'm a little bit torn on that.
Well, I think that goes to your point earlier about attention and who you're listening to. And I think one way to think of it is that when the camera's on, the person that they're giving attention to is not the person in the room. It's the person, their constituent back home whose vote that they're trying to get. And I think that I wouldn't say our judicial system is untransparent, even though it's not recorded. And I think that actually is a strong point to limiting recordings. When you were talking about housing, the direction I thought you were going to go in that immediately popped into my head, maybe because I'm living in it right now, was to build congressional dormitories.
The old boarding houses, right? Yeah, make them stay in the same room with each other. Yeah,
exactly. And down the hall or something like that. I remember my parents, when we were in Germany at the State Department, there was an American compound, nice apartment complexes, but they all lived in the same building. And like you said, there was one pool house and everyone would go there to grill or talk to folks and that sort of thing. But to talk more about in the real world today, and I know in your piece you call yourself a Jeremiah, or you don't want to be a Jeremiah in terms of doom and gloom. So to focus on not being a Jeremiah, do you think that there is anybody, either in politics or outside, because it might be hard to find people in politics who represent it, but who are a model of civic charity? Or
so I'm a big Arthur Brooks fan, former head of AEI, and this is his shtick right now. And he's written this book called Love Your Enemies. It's really a fabulous book, and Brooks is. I'm just repeating the sort of Arthur Brooks line. David Brooks as well has, I think, written effectively about this. The need to have weavers. So the good news. So the audience knows. Peter and I spoke in advance, and he gave me some good advice that I'm going to try and follow. And I don't mean to put words in his mouth, but he said, "Boy, Judge, your article really kind of ends on a downer. You sound pretty pessimistic." And I told him I am pessimistic, but for this group, I will try and lift my spirits and their spirits. So the downside, we all know the downside of the moment that we're living in right now, the tribalism, polarization, and it is awful. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area in the 60s and 70s. I can remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. I remember the assassination of President Kennedy. My family went to Constitution Avenue and watched his funeral cortege. I can remember the riots after Dr. King's death. I went to school with the sons and daughters of some of the key players in Watergate. I was there, along with my other friends in high school, marching on the streets against the war in Vietnam. And so I've seen a few things, okay, and in my view, what we're going through now is worse than any of those. It's worse than any of those. The polarization is so deep that it scares me. It actually scares me. So the purpose of this article and this talk that I give is it is a warning voice. It is sort of a Jeremiah role that this is serious, folks, and we've got to figure some way out of this, because it won't. We cannot sustain the constitutional order if the citizenry holds each other in contempt for one another. Now, okay, so that's the negative part. The positive part is this period that we're going through has unleashed a lot of great writing and thinking on this topic, and there are lots of great organizations. So if I can give a plug for one I'm involved with, I'm a senior advisor to a group that's called the National Institute for Civil Discourse. It's connected with the University of Arizona, but it's located in DC. It's a bipartisan group that's committed to the idea that no, we can actually reach compromise without having to give up core values. It's just that you gotta really figure out what your core values are, and they're probably more limited than you think, and you need to be able to give them up so that others can live their core values. It's tough thing, tough proposition, but it's that type of commitment that I think is necessary. And so there are lots of groups in this space. So that's the good news.
It's interesting.
The bad news is it's really hard. It's really, really hard, and we're in a really, really, really bad spot. So it's up to folks who are listening tonight and to me to do something about it.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's hard because to tell people this is something you feel strongly about, but you just have to compromise on this for us to continue to exist. I think the messaging today is never compromise, never apologize, and find your group that you can all be in the same room and all say the same things, and across the hall is a group saying the exact opposite. I think to the point of things that we can all agree on. It's tough nowadays because we have groups who say America is fundamentally flawed from the very first day that any European arrived on the soil. And on the other side, we have folks who say, but there are values written into our Constitution that are fundamental and important. And I guess the point I would raise to you is it's hard to find a huge list of them, certainly, but is there one that you think is incredibly particularly strong that we should focus on and that we can talk about?
Yeah, I think so. So it's a good question. It's always the first question I get when I get this Sunday school lesson, right? I mean, it's the first bit of pushback, because to be sure, the language of civility and compromise can be used to oppress, right? To keep the status quo when the status quo is not satisfactory, and I get that. But my response is a couple of things. First of all, as a prudential matter, you're not going to persuade somebody to change their views if you hold them in contempt. It just doesn't work. And so the point of democracy is persuasion, right? Is an attempt to persuade. We have this, hopefully it's not a fiction. Hopefully it's not, we have a mythology that hopefully grounded in reality, and that is the idea behind a democracy is that we talk to each other, we try and persuade one another, right? And so the first point I'd offer is you are not going to persuade someone if you hold them in contempt. Now, I became a Republican in the age of Ronald Reagan. I no longer have a partisan affiliation. I dropped that when I became a judge, and I've only recently stepped off the bench, so I'm not ready to resume partisan affiliation. But when I was, I became a Republican under Ronald Reagan's watch, right? And one of the things that Ronald Reagan taught conservatives was that happy conservatives are more likely to succeed than angry conservatives. And of course, he was held as contrast over against Barry Goldwater, held many of the same views. Goldwater was spectacularly unsuccessful. Ronald Reagan was spectacularly successful. That made a big impression on me. Happy conservatives are more likely to be successful. So first thing, drop the anger. It's not good for your soul, first of all, okay? But I'm not your rabbi, so I don't, but if I was, that's what I would say. It's not good for your soul. And second, it doesn't work. It may work in short term, but it doesn't work in the long term. Now, having said that, not everything's up for grabs, right? I mean, the uniqueness of the United States of America is that we are built around some ideas, right? It's not blood and soil and race and and religion. It's based around some ideas, and so there are ground rules to be in the House, right, and to be able to participate in the debate in the House. And the ground rules are, you're committed to the twin poles of the Declaration and the Constitution, and that is liberty and equality, right? That you got to be committed to those. Now, what do those mean? Well, we can argue about what those mean, but that's what we argue about. We're not here to say, I don't believe in liberty. I don't believe in equality. No, sorry, that's not us. We
Right.
built this country around some ideas, and I would say those are the two most animating ideas for the American experience. So you got to, if you want to be part of the community, that's what you got to be committed to. If you're not committed to that, sorry.
But part of the idea of civic charity, right, is that even precedes those values. It's the idea that you can even come together to discuss those values. Good
point. No, that's an excellent point. That is precedent to anything else. Again, I'm a big fan of Professor Akil Amar at Yale, and everyone probably knows his work, but if you don't, or even if you do, I would strongly recommend that you get his book, the Constitution, a Biography. It's what it is. It's a great approach to constitutional law. I mean, I was surprised in law school when I took con law that we spent the first day of my class, and I had an excellent teacher, Susanna Sherry. She's at Vanderbilt now. But I remember, as I recall, the first day of class, our reading assignment was to read the Constitution and to read Marbury versus Madison, right? And the first couple days of class were spent talking about Marbury versus Madison. And I thought that was odd. I thought the pedagogy would involve, let's start with the history of the Constitution. Let's read the text of the Constitution itself, and let's pore over each section, see what it means. But as most law students will know, that's typically not how it's done. The courses really aren't about the Constitution; they're about what the Supreme Court says about the Constitution. Professor Amar teaches an undergraduate course at Yale, where he actually goes through the Constitution, starting from the preamble to the end. Does a fabulous textual analysis, historical analysis, deals with some of the court cases, how it's been interpreted, but I just think it's the best thing I've seen on the Constitution. So Professor Amar's thesis is that the most fundamental liberty that the Constitution creates and protects is the liberty of the majority to set the rules by which society is governed. That the most fundamental liberty of the American Constitution is the idea that law is going to come from we the people, right? From what we the people understand law to be, and put it in the Constitution and the statutes. Obviously, we the people in the Constitution protect minorities in certain areas, but that comes about from a supermajority vote in the Constitution, created the Constitution. So that's the most fundamental liberty, according to Professor Amar, and I agree with him. What I'm trying to add is maybe something even more fundamental than that. Is what you just referred to, Peter. That before you even get to that structure that protects that liberty, you have to start with a yearning to have unity, a yearning to create community. And so in that sense, you're exactly right. That has to precede it. If that's not there, it's to borrow some scriptural imagery from the Christian tradition, it's sounding brass and tinkling cymbal, right? That's St. Paul's teachings about charity, right? It's vital. It's vital to community. It's vital to religious community. It's vital to domestic life, and it's vital to the life of the nation, of the Constitution. And so here's the challenge. So can I tell them why I'm pessimistic, though? Is that all right? And then
no, please do.
Here's why I'm pessimistic. Well, first of all, you look around, things aren't going so well on this civic charity front.
Certainly
but
not.
I'm pessimistic. Let me say, I won't say pessimistic. Let me just say how difficult the task is before us. But we can do hard things. Here's the difficult task. What we are trying to do right now in the United States of America is create a community on a continent with 300 plus million people, and we're trying to create a multiculturally diverse community. We really are trying to create e pluribus unum, right? And the pluribus has never been more pluribus than it is right now. To borrow from Christian imagery from the Book of Revelation, it looks like we're trying to create a nation out of every kindred, tongue, and people, right? That's what we're trying to do. Now, to continue with the Christian imagery, that is only accomplished under very different circumstances than obtained right now, right? That ideal of a people out of every nation, kindred, tongue, and people living in harmony, that occurs in scriptural imagery under very different circumstances that we obtain right now. But that's what we're trying to do now. Can it be done? Can it be done without the circumstances described in the Christian imagery? Well, we're trying to find that out right now. I think it's worth the effort, but let's not be deluded about just how difficult it is. So there's one of two choices. You can throw up your hands and say, well, it's too hard, we're just not going to do it. Let's just revert to our tribes and give up on the idea. That's not where I've put my bet. I've put my bet, placed my bet on no. Let's try and build that now. But that cannot be built. It just can't be done with a citizenry that's hold each other in contempt. It can only be done if there are bonds of affection.
So Judge, to pull in another, just a line of thought that I think has been, I had thought about this before, but it might be already in parallel. There's this idea of the paradox of tolerance, and that if you're tolerant of every idea in a system, intolerant ideas will come in. And so if you're in a system that is allowing people of different backgrounds and pluralities and beliefs to come in and saying everything all's all right, you might let in some ideas that are intolerant of the very system that allow it to exist.
No, you don't do that. No, there are bad ideas. And it's fair to say that's a bad idea. Look, white nationalism, white supremacy is a bad idea, okay? And so let's call it out for what it is, explain why it's a bad idea. But here's the key. We cannot be contemptuous of those who are expressing the idea. We've got, again, for prudential reasons, because you're not going to persuade them otherwise, and also I think actually for moral reasons, that we need to adopt, I believe, an ethic that treats others, even with terrible ideas, with respect. But no, you don't. You're not tolerant of bad ideas. You call them out.
Right. I agree, and to your point of treating them well, same in my faith with my family. It's no matter how bad the other person is, you should try and to find your heart to forgive them. People push back on that though, and they say, well, I'm biracial, for example, as we discussed. If some guy comes in and says you're a mutt, you're an abomination of mixed race and intermingling, and I believe that I have that obligation, but other people don't. Should we just be constantly like telling people that we need to have this sort of overwhelming love for our neighbor, even when they're totally wrong? And if so, like, how do we do that? How do we encourage that?
No, we do that. So Ben Sass has written a great book. What's it called? Them, Others, Them, something like that. He's on to this as well. I mean, that's what you do. That's what you do. You do not allow yourself, to quote Michelle Obama, probably not often quoted at Federalist Society events, but remember she said, when they go low, we go high. That's a great principle. Get it out of the partisan sense. But no, I think that's exactly what you do. Because, when you descend into vitriol, they've won. And that just can't. Now, again, this isn't a mamby-pamby, gauzy sentimentality that we're all leaves on the same tree, all waves in the same ocean, and every idea is the same. No, there are good ideas, there are better ideas, there are best ideas, there's some bad ideas.
Right.
Need to call those out. It's just the manner, as much as anything, it's the manner in which it's done that that's critical for creating these bonds of affection. Look, I keep citing Lincoln's first inaugural. Let's remember the context. 7 states had seceded from the Union. The ship was going down, right? And did Lincoln succeed in calling for bonds of affection? Well, at one level, no. War came, and the consequences of it are present today. Someone pointed out to me the other day, well, actually, no, some of it succeeded. There were 4 of the border states that didn't secede. And as a practical matter, that was critical to the Union's success. So anyway, the point is, I think you can't too often go wrong if you made some mistakes. But to me, he's the great secular role model, exemplar, and look what Lincoln did at this moment of greatest peril. He pled for these bonds of affection to hold out. They weren't strong enough. He didn't succeed, but he tried, and I'm saying that's the same message that I think we ought to be using today. So.
Of course, and he was very willing to call out bad ideas. I mean, very strong on
that.
Yeah,
no, absolutely.
And absolutely. We'll be pivoting to questions in a moment here. So for the attendees, please submit questions. There's a couple great ones that have already been submitted, and they were in line with something I wanted to ask. And I think that for me, one thing that I find interesting is a seep, because it seems like it's a greater problem now than it was in the past. So therefore, something has been going on over the past several decades, even from when you were younger, that has led to this increased polarization. Obviously, part of that is the sort of nationalization of media and social media and this overexposure. And one of the questions was, how do we effectively pursue civic charity in a societal environment where media outlets and the news industry are not only incentivized to exploit differences, but also play an outsized role in driving public discourse? And I would follow that up with saying, do you think the media does a good enough job of calling out bad ideas?
No. So here's the problem with the media. We've got this daggone First Amendment, it's just such a nuisance, right? I'm joking, if anyone, just to be clear.
For the record, yeah.
For the record, I'm joking, but I mean, it's a problem. That's a problem we're going to live with. But we have an explosion of outlets with ideas. How do you counter that? You don't counter that. That's what happens in a free culture. But as an individual, how do you counter that? Well, I rely upon, I'm going to butcher this quote, but you've probably heard it before. It came from an Oxford Don back in the beginning of the 20th century, an address he gave to his students as they were about to begin their studies at Oxford. And it goes something like this: you're about to embark on your rigorous course of studies over the next couple of years. You'll learn many things. You'll learn to think in certain ways. You'll learn facts and theories, but those, in fact, the only really important thing that you will get from your education, the only really important thing is that you will learn to know when a man is talking rot, right? So that's the key. Sorry, the bad news here is you got to be educated. You have to be able to see through the rot, and that's not an easy thing to do. I do have one bit of advice in that regard. If you are consuming most of your information about the world through cable news outlets, stop it. You're being played. And it sounded like the questioner understood this even better than I did. I mean, we know it's an outrage industrial complex, and that I'm borrowing from Arthur Brooks there. I mean, there is not breaking news every 10 minutes. It's just not, except on cable. And why is there breaking news every 10 minutes on cable? Well, because they've learned that how human psychology works, right? And if we have a sense that things are outrageous, our eyes are glued, and that increases revenues from ads. It's a game. It's a game. Don't let yourself get played in the game. Don't rely upon television for your information. Television is there for your entertainment, right? This is bad. This is really bad news. It takes hard work to cut through what the media outlets are throwing at you. It takes hard work. So, but it's got to be done. Now, what's the solution to all this? It's localism. It's localism. It's you, wherever you end up, you get involved in your community. You get involved in your church or your synagogue or your mosque. If you're secular, or even if you're not secular, you get involved in the schools, the civic organizations. I mean, listen, Tocqueville taught us this, right? This is the strength of America. It's all these platoons out there, and that's where these bonds of affection are best going to be forged and strengthened. Because I'm afraid it's not going to happen in Washington, D.C. first. The incentives are just too great to prevent it, unless another Abraham Lincoln comes along, right? I mean, so in all seriousness, I had a colleague of mine who was not on the D.C. circuit, who was on another court of appeals, a very distinguished jurist, talked to me about this a couple of years ago, and he said this. He said, "Tom, I pray every day that the Lord will raise up another Abraham Lincoln." That really struck me. That's not the type of talk you normally have amongst judges, right? But it really struck me. So barring that, I'm not certain anything's going to happen at the national level that's going to affect this. Now, obviously, if there are people listening to me who are going to be senators in the next 10 or 15 years, take it, try it out on Capitol Hill. But for most of us, it's going to be in our local communities, and that's where the change is going to happen, I believe. I hope.
Judge, it's so fascinating to hear you say this, because I've been having these conversations with my friends and peers and at Georgetown, at UVA Law, and very many similar points get raised. There's a famous book that I'm sure you've heard about, Bowling Alone, which talks about the decrease in communitarianism in the United States. And I appreciate you assuming that I would know about the Oxford Don in his speech. I think perhaps you might think I read a little bit more than I do. But And to the point of of Abraham Lincoln, literally this week I had a conversation where I said, we need a leader who can bring us together and heal us. My cousin is very progressive, and we try to talk on the phone, and he says, I only hear liberal news outlets, and I don't even know where to go to get reliable news anymore. And the rise of cable news, I totally agree. It reminds me of that there's recent litigation with Tucker Carlson. And in the litigation, they said there's no way a reasonable person could think that this is anything but entertainment about the Tucker Carlson show. And that's not limited to Fox, and that's not to only throw stones at Tucker Carlson. I think it's systemic and it's natural to every cable news organization. But so to hammer away again, so the point is, don't consume just your news from cable. Where can the attendees on this call go to consume good news, and how can they get involved in their locals? What are some institutions that you were involved with on a local level that allowed you to be civically engaged?
Yeah. So, I mean, there are lots of great sources. Unfortunately, it takes reading. It's rare. And, podcasts are great. And I get that. And I listen to a number of podcasts. My reading habits are fairly standard. Every day I read the New York Times, the Washington Post, and the Wall Street Journal, right? I mean, that's sort of the canon, right? I read the Atlantic. I read the National Review. I read Public Discourse. I read Law and Liberty. I read First Things. I think those are probably reading lists, but you come up with your own, right? And those cover a wide range of views, but those are the places that I tend to go to more often. In terms of local involvement, I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I'm an active believing member there. That's a church that professional clergy. It's lay leadership. So what that means is, if you're in, you're in. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done, and so most of my time that's not been spent on my career has been spent in the life of my church and my family, in the life of the church as well. But there are other, you don't have to be a person of faith to do that. But you ought to be involved in something bigger than yourself for a lot of different reasons. And lawyers should as well. And I'll tell you why. If I don't get too personal here about my experience. So when I'm around law students, and when I'm around lawyers, I'm finding this out even now as a retired judge. I get treated really well. And that says a whole lot about the way the judiciary is viewed in our country. And I'm the beneficiary of that, right? People think better of me than probably they should, simply because I'm a judge. When I go to church, I teach high school students and college students. High school students on Sunday, college students on Wednesday night. And you know what? It's not Judge Griffith, it's Brother Griffith, right? And you know what? Those high school kids could care less that I was a member of the DC circuit. They could care less as easily as they will anyone else's. And that is, for me, really good. It's really good. Now, I'm offering that to you future lawyers out there, because with your legal education, you're going to be an elite. For better or for worse, you're going to be an elite. And it's going to be real important for you to get outside that elite community that you're in and deal with, non-lawyers, real people who are at different socioeconomic, on different rungs on the socioeconomic ladder, people of different races and backgrounds. But you're going to have to work hard to do that. But if you do, life will be richer for you, and it'll be much more fulfilling. And I hate to throw this in, and you'll be a better lawyer. but you will. But don't do it just so you'll be a better lawyer. Do it so that you'll be a better person. So.
Of course, it's like, it's the whole anger is bad for your heart. Being nice to other people is a good thing, but it's also
a good thing. It's a good thing
for you too.
Yeah.
And if I might humbly add some more suggestions to the students here, I highly recommend you run for your local school board. You understand the need of students sometimes even better than the other people in your community. And there's the American Legion and Rotary clubs and parent teacher associations, all sorts of things. They need help, and they need young people. There's not enough young people volunteering for things, as for everything I've seen, and get involved.
Look, for better or for worse, lawyers are the leaders in our country. I actually think that's for the better, so be a leader. So my political hero for many years was Republican Congressman from New York, Jack Kemp. Many people have said he's probably maybe the most influential conservative who was never president of the United States. Although William F. Buckley was pretty influential. But anyway, I was a Jack Kemp Republican and admired Kemp for many reasons. He was sort of like the original compassionate conservative. But anyway, Kemp had a habit with his children that when he'd send them off to school each day, he'd say to them, "Be a leader, be a leader." And that's as a lawyer, that's what you're going to be eventually. Or you should be. You're going to be a leader. So be the leader on the school board, be the leader in the Rotary, but be a leader.
Oh, I think that.
I feel like we turned this from a legal discussion into a tent rally, right? So.
Well, it's hard when you're talking about William F. Buckley.
There you go.
Keep him on the desk. Needs to be read, but don't have time for that right now. About that. But,
over the holidays. Yeah. Over the holidays.
But to bring it back to, I guess, to the legal concept. And there's a couple of questions. This one, in the preface, they say this is a rather pessimistic question. But if one side is unwilling to listen, then how can the other side effectively argue their point? If they raise their voices to be heard, they sink to the other side's level and fighting breaks out. And if they are quiet, then they will be talked over and ignored. Is there a solution to this dilemma?
No, it's hard. No, I'm going to say it's hard. This is really hard. And I don't have any illusions that when you make your arguments without contempt, trying your best to be kind and considerate, I have no illusions that it's going to work, right? It's most of the time it's not, because you're going to be dealing with irrational people who are not willing to listen to you. But but sometimes it will work, right? Sometimes it will work. So in preparing for tonight, Peter asked me to think of a recent example of civic charity. And I would commend to all of you a speech that many people think is maybe the greatest political speech of the 20th century. That may be a bit much. But on the night that Martin Luther King was killed, April 4th, 1968, Robert F. Kennedy was in Indiana. He was running for the Democratic nomination for the presidency. He had a rally scheduled that evening in downtown Indianapolis in a Black neighborhood. And he learned on the way to the rally that Dr. King had been killed. He arrived at the rally, stood on the back of a flatbed truck, and announced, he was the one, this is days before the internet, right? No cell phones. He was the one that announced to this crowd, largely of Black Americans living in Indianapolis, that Dr. King had been killed. And then he gave an extemporaneous speech that many consider to be one of the great speeches of the 20th century. Go look that up and see what he talks about. When Robert F. Kennedy ran for the presidency, he announced his candidacy for the presidency earlier that year in 1968. He uttered a phrase which is just, I think, absolutely remarkable. He said, "I run for the presidency because I want the United States to stand for the reconciliation." That's who we can be. That's who we have been, and that's who I hope we will yet be. But no, you're right. It's hard. It's really hard work, but we can do hard things, right?
I think we can do hard things, and but that doesn't. Yeah, but they are hard.
Yeah.
Another question was, and to bring it back, I guess, a little more to your personal experience from Luke. In your experience on the federal bench, do you believe that you and your peers acted according to principles of civic charity? If not, are there any reforms you would suggest to increase collegiality among federal judges? If so, any further suggestions on exporting that to other branches of government?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And I can tell you, in the 15 years I served on the DC Circuit, absolutely, we treated one another that way. There was a strong ethic of collegiality before I got there, and I didn't do anything to undercut it, and no one else did either. And in many ways, the judiciary can lead the way here, right? By showing reasoned discourse, passionate argument and disagreement, but hopefully never crossing the line into contempt. And for that, I would hold our present Supreme Court up as a wonderful example. And let me tell you a true story, okay? This comes from the confirmation of Justice Kavanaugh. We all know what a bruising and awful experience that was. We failed in many ways. Dr. Blasey Ford was not treated well. Justice Kavanaugh was certainly not treated well. We didn't do well on that. So Justice Kavanaugh was confirmed, if I'm remembering correct, it was mid-afternoon on Saturday, 3-4 o'clock in the afternoon or something. He immediately took the oath of office and was in his new chambers that Saturday evening, because there was argument that was going to be heard the next week, Monday or Tuesday. Within 24 hours of his confirmation, all 8 of his new colleagues had come by individually to see him in his chambers. Okay, I was honored to be at his formal swearing in at the White House a couple days after that. All of his colleagues came and watched that, sat on the front row. They sat during a harangue by the president that, excuse me, was highly inappropriate, was highly partisan. And yet Justice Kavanaugh's colleagues came to be with him. You know, they have, you probably know this, that the justices of the Supreme Court have lunch together. Each day they have oral argument. That's about 60 times a year. Now, is there anyone in your life you have lunch with 60 times a year? I don't. And they have a rule during lunch: no business. So at least 60 times a year, they sit down together and they talk about books they've read. They've talked about family. They talk about travel. They talk about sports. They talk about everything but work. And so what happens is you have 9 people who disagree passionately about things, but who genuinely get along. I hope, and I think maybe you'll see some of this, I hope that they will take that show on the road a little bit more. I mean, I would love to see Justice Kagan and Justice Gorsuch do a dog and pony show around the country where they display to one another that they can disagree about fundamental things and still we saw that in the life of Justice Ginsburg and Justice Scalia. What I'm offering is that was not unique. That may have seemed odd because of their differing views, but that's not unique. That's how things are done on the Supreme Court. And so, yeah, I think the judiciary can be a role model for how this should take place. We can have reasoned discourse without contempt.
Yeah, I think that's exactly, it's an example, right, of the collegiality, the socialization together that took place in the Constitutional Convention.
Exactly.
There is a follow-up question from another individual, but that's tied to this. And it makes me think of the recent example where I think there was a liberal senator who had hugged a conservative senator and then was reprimanded afterwards for that interaction. But on the opposite side, Frank asks, at what point does civility between lawmakers become perceived as collusion between elites? Is there any way to reverse that trend in perception?
I don't accept the premise of that. If someone wants to say that civility in disagreement is a form of collusion, I don't get that. And once again, I'm not talking about agreeing. It's not a matter that you have to agree on everything. You don't. You disagree about fundamental principles. That's fine. It's just the way you go about doing it. That's all it is. So I don't think that anyone would suspect that there's, collusion between two senators who vote differently on a matter. It's just that how do they explain their vote to one another and then to their electorate? So look, John McCain got lots of bonus points in polite society, at least. Remember during the 2008 campaign, he's at a town hall, and a woman stood up and said, Barack Obama was a Muslim, and so she wasn't going to listen to him. And remember what Senator McCain did? He was kind, he was forceful, but he said, "No, ma'am, that's not true." And then he went up and say, "He's a very good man. He's a good family man. We just happen to disagree about things." Well, there's my nirvana, that political opponents say, "Look, my opponent's a good person, right? Good person. We just happen to disagree about the role of government in our lives. She's for X, I'm for Y." So here's a model. Okay, you asked me for models. Go get President Bush's statement issued the other day, congratulating President-elect Biden. Read that statement. I think it's a model of charity to President-elect Biden and to President Trump. And maybe you think I'm biased because President Bush appointed me, but there's no professional achievement in my life of which I am more proud than to have my name associated in any way with George W. Bush. I'm not saying I agreed with all his policies, but he's a man of great character and a model of civic charity. And just to show you that I can be bipartisan, I feel the same way about Senator Lieberman, who I know well. Great human being.
Well, Judge, so, I would never accuse you of impropriety.
Although I guess that doesn't count for bipartisan because he's not a Democrat anymore. So
right,
there are plenty of Democrats who are.
Well, certainly you mentioned RFK and the like, and I was gonna say I would never accuse you of impropriety, and it's certainly not just because you're a judge. And as we're reaching the end of the time here, I think it would be good to have a recap of certain important points. You talked about the importance of localism, the importance of having a fundamental commitment to civic charity before we talk about liberty and equality and role models in Jack Kemp and RFK and Abraham Lincoln. And I guess the one question I want to end on before we then briefly before Elizabeth takes us out is when you're looking at applying this in your life, tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that, and how you're spreading the message, is there a theme that you return to that inspires you to keep spreading it?
Yeah, but it's deeply religious. Is that okay?
It's a free country.
So my one of my favorite writers is C.S. Lewis, right? I mean, and in his, I think the greatest sermon he ever gave, The Weight of Glory, he uses a phrase, and it's in the Christian idiom, but if you're not Christian, it's a universal principle, but he expressed it in a Christian idiom, and so I'm gonna quote him for it. He said, "Next to the Blessed Sacrament itself, your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses." So that's the impulse. Jefferson expressed a similar idea. We hold these truths to be obvious, right? To be self-evident, that all men are created equal, right? We're created, imago Dei, we're created in the image of God. And I think our vocation is to not be sectarian about it, but to carry forth that idea, that insight into our politics. In that same sermon, Lewis says, all play, all politics everything should be done with that in mind, with that principle in mind. And so I don't succeed at this, but I aspire to. Now I have I know we're out of time, but I have a background that I'll just tell you just a little bit about it that will either disqualify me, will either totally undercut everything I've said up to now, or maybe give some of the listeners reason to think that maybe he's got a point or two. So I'm a latecomer to conservatism, right? I grew up as a political liberal. I worked for Morris K. Udall, who was a Democratic congressman from Tucson. He happened to be a neighbor of mine in McLean, Virginia, and he was my first employer, my first mentor. And I grew up I came of age in Democratic Party circles. And then I jokingly tell my liberal friends, and then I learned how to read, then I over time I became conservative. I was largely influenced by Ronald Reagan and Jack Kemp, and by the writings of Milton Friedman and Tom Sowell and William F. Buckley. I changed my mind. So does that show that maybe that shows some weakness, right? Maybe that shows lack of commitment. But as a result of it, I've never been able to muster up the passion to think that liberals were my enemies, right? They just happen to have a different view about how to get to the common good than I do. I think they're wrong, but you know what? Maybe I'm wrong, right? The great learned hand in a speech that's part of the American canon, right, said, the spirit of liberty is the spirit that's not too sure that it's right? Humility comes with it. And Oliver Cromwell, the great Puritan revolutionary, said, I beseech ye in the bowels of Christ. So I think there's a certain humility that we ought to approach these things with, and a certain sense of respect for others. So based on my experiences being a convert to conservatism, I just can't muster up the courage to think that a political liberal is my enemy. My opponent on the field of ideas, to be sure, but not my enemy. I played sports in high school. I lost a lot of games. We won some. I don't ever remember when we won a game having, or even when we lost a game, having ill feelings towards the competitors. Not at all, right? Not at all. Anyway.
I think for me, that only strengthened the point. For the attendees, if you can read anything by any of the individuals that the judges mentioned, I highly recommend it. Love Thomas Sowell, Milton Friedman, Buckley, they're all great. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Judge, this has been an absolute pleasure, but I will now pass it off to Elizabeth to take us out.
Thank you, Peter. Enjoyed it.
All right, everyone. Well, this concludes our event for tonight. Thank you so much again to Judge Griffith for coming to speak with us, and to Peter for moderating. I think I can speak for all of us in saying that we really appreciate both your insight and your advice. And then also thank you to everyone else for coming to our final event of the semester. We really appreciate your involvement, and we hope to see you at all of our events next semester. All right, good night, everyone. Thanks for coming.
Good night. Stay safe.
Good night, folks.